Hi, this is Anthony Parent of IRS Medic, and a lot of our discussion is about how FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, affects expats around the world. But the truth is, it can affect anybody who has assets overseas, including people in the U.S. Now, Keith Redmond is here, global advocate for the Americans overseas. But some of the people contacting you aren't quite overseas. What's going on, Keith?
Yeah, this is a population that seems to be forgotten, perversely affected by FATCA. As you know, I spend a bit of time here in Washington because of Washington, D.C., because of family issues, medical issues. And I have gotten involved into the expat community, specifically the French, but generally speaking, in the expat community as a whole. And what I mean by that is other countries' expats living in the United States. And what I have found is that these individuals are having problems as well back in their home countries. Um, I will use France as an example, but this could be any other country. So French expats living in the United States are getting letters from their banks back in France stating that their accounts will be closed because they have a US address and that they can no longer have a relationship with them. Number one. Number two, I've had French expats tell me that they have had their mortgages rescinded, their investments accounts closed because of having a US address. Now, they have not specifically come out in writing stating it's due to FATCA, but when they have spoken to the banks, they have stated verbally it's as a result of FATCA. So these individuals are being harmed as well, along with Americans overseas and accidental Americans. So it is a serious issue that's affecting non Americans as well as Americans or identified U.S. persons. It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah,
Just
and
because of a
absolutely.
U.S. address.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's their home country. It's their
and
home country.
the common fact pattern that I run across, because it is something that happens, is that a U.S. Service member will go overseas and fall in love, and they move back to the U.S. afterwards. I just talked to a gentleman who was stationed in Japan yesterday, and his wife came back, and oh yeah, so it is something that happens, and so now, what are the solutions here? Because I can think, because I've dealt with and helped a lot of people. What are their primary concerns when this occurs, Keith?
Well, their primary concerns is that a lot of them don't know if they're going to be spending the rest of their lives in the United
Oh,
States.
right,
They're there for particular reasons, or they just don't know
right,
what the future is, and they
right.
also have they have, let's say, a home in France, let's say, and they have a mortgage on that home, or they have investment accounts that they put money in, or whatever. They just have a bank account in their home country. Some of them have been able to get around it by getting like a family member giving permission to use their address, if you will, and how would you say in English? They would make up a document stating that this person lives here, or this is their permanent address in France. So that has worked, but there are a lot of people that don't have that option, and so they're really, pardon my French, no pun intended, but they're really screwed. And it is a problem. And it seems to be a growing problem. I hear about it from more and more people. And again, this is not just France. It can happen everywhere, like you
Yeah,
had just shared.
right, and it's typically the countries are that our servicemen go out to that.
Well, that's one population, but I'm
Right,
talking about, just other countries' expats
sure. Oh, right, and then people come here for job, for a
for
job, and then they
jobs.
fall in love.
Right.
Then they fall in love here,
Or
like
they fall in
okay,
love, or they don't,
right,
or it's a French couple living in the United States,
right. A lot,
and
yeah, and a lot of times they're thinking, well, maybe we'll move back after
right.
we
And it's
retire. The
actually
kids are
normal
older,
that
we'll move back, right? That is a
right. And
common.
or they have rental income that's coming in, and they want their renter to be able to pay into a French bank account because what they're renting is in France. You see what I mean? So this is very practical things that people have in their lives that's being taken away from them,
Mhm.
all as a result of U.S. extraterritorial policies like FATCA. The damage
Mm.
is wide. The damage is wide, and it's global.
Yeah, the damage is very wide. The situation you're describing, um, though, is actually the application of FATCA to U.S. residents, right? Because these are people who
Are U.S. residents, correct?
they're U.S. residents, right? And I think we've talked about this before, but anybody who wants to take up residency in the United States from another country needs to be very, very cautious about what their asset composition is, and that when they arrive. And there's no difference between what you're describing and somebody who that is from a U.S. and regulatory perspective. There's no difference between the expat, the French expat living in the United States, and the U.S. citizen who grew up in the United States, with an account outside the United States. And that's why they're being sucked into that. And I mean, arguably, it's horrible, but it's far less egregious than the application of this to Americans abroad, because at least, I'm not defending this, but I'm just pointing out that these are in fact U.S. residents, right, who are being subject to FATCA. It's just a population of U.S. residents.
Right. But if you're having your mortgage rescinded as a result, that's pretty egregious.
I'm not saying it's not egregious. I think the whole thing is egregious. There's no question
Yeah.
about it, because it fails to distinguish, as always, it fails to distinguish a resident American who's trying to offshore income or assets, and somebody just happened to move to the United States. I mean, this is the problem with this stuff. And I think it's a particularly good example of, what happens when you try to cast a net that is so wide. I would point out the one other aspect of this, that, you talk about expats. Well, the United States has expats from other countries. So do other countries, though, as well. And the CRS would catch those people too, right? In this particular case, because say you have France and, I don't know, make up any other, Canada, say, right? If you had a French, what would happen? Would it catch them?
Right, but their accounts, because they're not falling under the FATCA regime, their accounts are not being closed because they don't have that 30%.
Worse than FATCA. I'm in no defending this. I am just, I'm just sort of thinking out loud, what's the correct analytical box to put this in, right? And I think the correct analytical box is that, these are U.S. residents, right? Now, what's interesting is that I have a suggestion on this, actually. I have a suggestion on how this can be handled. So, if you're not a U.S. citizen, right, you can benefit from tax treaty tiebreak provisions. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, it may be, depending on the circumstances, that somebody caught up in this could look to the treaty and use the treaty to effectively sever residency with the United States for FATCA purposes. For example, green card holders who live in Canada are actually directed by the Canada Revenue Agency to rely on the treaty to take the position they're not U.S. tax residents. Compare that to, say, a Brazil that does not have a U.S. tax treaty. Because there is no tax treaty, a green card holder living in Brazil could not escape the FATCA thing. And then you look at the provisions of different treaties. For example, the UK treaty may, the way I read it, it may very well be that a green card holder living in the UK cannot use the tax treaty tiebreaker in most circumstances. So anyway, if you have somebody having that kind of problem, suggest they might want to look to the tax treaty as a possible way of taking the position they're not a U.S. resident, therefore not subject to this.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think the one benefit, and I always use France as an example for obvious reasons, I think the one benefit that they have is they actually have a representative that represents them in the Northeast Mid-Atlantic region at the National Assembly. So they have a voice to voice their serious concern. So that's a big plus there that Americans overseas don't have at Congress. So, but that's a whole nother issue. But at least they have a conduit, at least to have their voices heard.
Yeah.
So,
not to have it.
So, and
Yeah.
again, these are people who can be 100% who will always been 100% compliance in all their tax obligations.
Oh yeah,
And yet,
yeah. It has
right. I mean, so
absolutely
there's no, hey, we need to get you into some program because you haven't disclosed stuff. I mean,
not at all. They pay their
some
taxes
people
in the
we was sure,
U.S.
but yeah, no, they've always been doing everything correctly.
Right.
And then one day, oh, we're going to shut down your bank account. Why is that? Well, you haven't done anything correctly, but ever.
Yeah.
But there's a law that was passed because you might do something incorrectly, and now because of that, we can't do business with you anymore.
Well, that's right. I think it's much better from a government point of view to take the position that everything is prohibited unless expressly allowed.
Carve outs. That's
Which,
what they are, right, John?
that's right. Yeah, and then you provide carve outs. But one other point, Keith, on the specific example you're using, I recognize it's the specific example.
Yeah.
But okay, so you have a French expat living in the United States who has a house they're renting in France. That income is clearly sourced to France. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
France has first rights of taxation, or the U.S. has no way to collect.
Right.
There's no U.S. tax owing on that anyway, right? So I mean, it compounds the absurdity and injustice of the situation. I mean, not only is there a problem because they have the bank account, okay. But the purpose of the bank account is to deposit income source in France that the U.S. doesn't have primary taxing rights over anyway. I mean, seriously, you can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't. It's just absolutely absurd.
But I mean, your basic point is absolutely correct. And, this is why anybody moving to the United States or even considering it needs, I think, very, very serious counseling before taking that step, because these are the kinds of things you get involved in.
Absolutely. That can't be said enough. What you just said.
Yeah. And, and I think this is sort of and I think maybe this is the big point of this entire podcast in what we're doing. Yes, we're interested in the people who this is absolutely affecting. We're really concerned with that. But for me, this is all a precursor of things that are to come, that everything the IRS is doing, whatever the government is doing on a small scale, is a trial balloon. It's all a trial balloon to say, okay, let's work out the kinks. So when we put this on a large scale, we'll have everything worked out. And it reminds me of something. It reminds me of a poem. And a poem that starts off with, "First they came."
Yeah.
That's right, Anthony. But if you were to actually recite that online, that would be considered to be the most subversive thing. So I suggest before citing the poem, you might say that it came from a German pastor, okay, and not some kind of a dissident or
right. Yes, exactly. It was a Lutheran pastor who wrote it in 1946. Right. Yeah. So and this is what it is, and I think the thing is, like, I'm not here claiming that socialism is the answer or communism is the answer, but a lot of the labels, right? People are put into identities that might not be them. They're put into identities that are not them, so they could be labeled, okay, they're the enemy. That wasn't them, but they were put there. And so that's really, I think, the important context is like, what are these labels anyway? What do they mean? So the poem goes like this. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
Anthony, I think that we might be able to modify a little bit of that for the attitude of Americans abroad towards this. How about something?
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
First, they came for the people who owned the foreign mutual funds. I didn't speak out because I just didn't have any. Then they came for the people who had to pay phantom capital gains on the sale of their house, but I didn't speak out because I didn't own a house. Then they came for the small business owners and confiscated their retirement plans under the transition tax, but I didn't speak out because I didn't have a small business. And now they're coming for me, and there's nobody left to speak out. I mean, and this is why, I really think that these Americans abroad who think that this is not a problem are absolutely, positively delusional.
Oh, I'd go further, John, and this is, I think, really the point of our podcast. Any person alive, any person on this planet, it's not just any American, any person who's been in America, any person on the planet should be alarmed, because where's this going? Where's this going? We are going to, it's obvious that we don't have anyone actually representing our interests. Who is pulling the strings, and where is it going next? Why is it important that we have collection of data and people feeling control of some central thing that doesn't really do too much for them? It just wants to control them. What's that about? Is that to condition or to lay the groundwork for something that's going to be coming? Nothing, these things don't come out of nowhere.
And these questions won't be answered until somebody stands up and says, enough.
Largely, Keith, you make the point that Americans abroad don't have political representation. I agree that's a problem, but it's not the real problem. The real problem is that Americans abroad will not stand up themselves. They
won't. Generally speaking, you're right. They will not do that.
They won't. Okay. These are not Ukrainians, or something, believe me. Okay. No. And that's, with all the Americans abroad, if they actually came together and, stop this pathetic allegiance to various political parties, and thought of themselves as independents, and recognized and used the power of their vote to best effect change, this could be achieved. But it's not going to be achieved if they just sort of ignore this.
And if they don't think of themselves as Americans living outside the United States, because many of them think of themselves as Americans who are still living in the United States, and they act accordingly. That's a problem.
These policies, all the more reason.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, guys,
it just shows another population.
Then I think this is described. It's that, when I say with Congress, it's not that they don't care, they don't care. Well, I think I could safely extend that to the community of Americans abroad. It's not that they don't care, it's that they don't care that they don't care.
Unless they get caught up in it. Then it's different.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
A lot of, and I will conclude with this. A lot of people who have been thinking about renouncing citizenship, I've been getting calls, I'm sure John's been too, and they've been watching. People have been watching these discussions. And I think
I've been getting calls as well, so it's there.
And I think the thing is and I think the Dodge Stratus, John, I think that might go on my website.
5 people in the world, that knew a Dodge Stratus. For everybody else, it's so nondescript.
Right. What's that? And the Dodge Stratus is in reference to another podcast that we've done.
The previous podcast, yeah.
Yeah.
That is basically what we have. All right. So with that, guys, conclude. Thank you very much. We're going to be also talking about some other topics coming up soon. We actually want to talk about the Fatca IGAs, what they are exactly, and if a move to residency-based taxation would make Fatca obsolete or not operable. And I would say this, my first inclination is it should. But knowing what I know, we'll find out.
We'll find out.
So join us next time for Keith Redmond and John Richardson. This is Anthony Parent of IRS Medic. Thanks for watching.